It was the evening of December 29, 1972. Eastern Airlines Flight 401 was scheduled to depart from New York's JFK Airport and land in Miami, Florida, a routine flight for the experienced crew. At the helm of the aircraft was Captain Robert Bob Loft, 55 years old, with more than 29 years of flying experience. Beside him sat First Officer Albert Stockstill, 39, a former Air Force pilot and seasoned commercial aviator. The flight engineer, Donald Repo, aged 51, was also highly experienced. The flight was operating an L-1011 TriStar, a wide-body jet that boasted cutting-edge systems and automation for its time. Flight 401 took off from JFK shortly after 9 p.m. The flight proceeded normally as it soared over the eastern seaboard, descending gradually toward its destination. The weather in Miami was calm. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. As the aircraft approached Miami, the crew lowered the landing gear. At that moment, a small green indicator light, used to confirm the nose gear was locked into position, failed to illuminate. Concerned, the crew abandoned their landing attempt and requested a holding pattern over the Florida Everglades at 2,000 feet to troubleshoot the issue. Air traffic control approved the request, and the aircraft turned west, flying away from the airport into the darkness of the wetlands. What the crew didn't know was that the landing gear had actually deployed properly. The only issue was a burnt-out indicator bulb in the cockpit, but this minor malfunction would prove disastrous. Inside the cockpit, the three men became consumed with the problem. Loft, Stockstill, and Repo focused entirely on the malfunctioning light. They tried reinserting the bulb, checking the circuit breakers, and even ordered a crew member into the avionics bay below the cockpit to visually confirm the gear status. While all this happened, autopilot was left engaged, but unknown to the crew, it had accidentally disconnected partially, causing the plane to enter a slow descent. In the dimly lit cockpit, no one noticed. There was no alarm. No sudden jolt, just a slow, barely perceptible drop. Over the course of several minutes, the L-1011 lost altitude steadily, dropping from 2,000 feet toward the swamp below. At 11:42 p.m., the aircraft crashed into the Florida Everglades at approximately 227 miles per hour. The massive jet tore through sawgrass, water, and muck, breaking into several sections. The crash was sudden, violent, and terrifying. Of the 176 people on board, 101 lost their lives, including Captain Loft and flight engineer Repo. Many died on impact, while others succumbed to injuries or drowned in the swampy terrain. Yet, 75 people survived, thanks in large part to the aircraft's relatively flat descent angle and the soft, waterlogged ground that cushioned the crash. Survivors found themselves in the darkness, surrounded by water, mud, and chaos. Some were waist-deep in alligator-infested waters. Others clung to floating debris or helped fellow passengers. Rescue efforts were complicated by the crash site's location. The Everglades are vast and inaccessible. Helicopters, airboats, and swamp buggies were deployed as emergency crews raced against time to save lives. Among the heroes was an off-duty flight attendant, Trudy Smith, who used seat cushions and wreckage to keep injured passengers afloat. By the early morning hours, the last of the survivors had been evacuated. But the tragedy would not end there. The National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, launched a thorough investigation. The cause of the crash was initially unclear. The plane had not suffered an engine failure, structural malfunction, or sabotage. Black box data revealed the haunting truth. No one had been flying the plane during its final descent. All three cockpit crew members had been distracted by the landing gear indicator. They had trusted the autopilot, but the system had quietly disengaged. The final verdict: pilot error, aggravated by a minor mechanical fault. It was the first fatal crash of a wide-body aircraft, but it also led to a series of safety reforms, including better cockpit resource management, ensuring that future flight crews would always monitor instruments even when troubleshooting. Eastern Airlines salvaged parts from the wreckage of Flight 401. Several functional components, including galley equipment and avionics, were refurbished and installed into other aircraft in the fleet. That's when strange stories began to surface. Flight attendants and pilots began reporting unexplained sightings on planes that had Flight 401 parts. Some claimed to see a man in a pilot's uniform appearing and vanishing without a trace. Others said they encountered flight engineer Repo, seen inspecting equipment that later turned out to be faulty, before disappearing into thin air. Passengers who had no knowledge of the crash described eerie encounters with uniformed crew members who were not on the manifest. Shortly after Flight 401's parts were reused in other Eastern Airlines aircraft, strange incidents began to emerge, quietly at first. Flight attendants began reporting the appearance of a uniformed man in the galley of certain L-10-11 planes. Some crew members recognized him instantly, not from the current flight, but from pictures of flight engineer Don Repo, one of the men who had perished in the crash. Even more chilling were accounts from pilots who claimed to see Captain Bob Loft himself. One Eastern captain reportedly sat down next to a man in the cockpit jump seat, assuming he was a deadheading pilot. When he turned to speak, the man had vanished. He later recognized the figure from photos. It was Loft. One flight attendant refused to fly after seeing the ghost of Repo, warning her about a possible mechanical problem. Minutes later, the issue was confirmed during pre-flight checks. The most famous of these paranormal events occurred aboard another L-10-11 aircraft, dubbed the Spirit Plane by some crew members. According to documented reports, a flight engineer saw Repo's face reflected in an oven door. Shocked, he heard the ghost say, "Watch out for fire on this plane." Sure enough, that same aircraft later experienced an engine fire during flight. No lives were lost, and the incident was contained. But whispers spread throughout Eastern Airlines. Another stewardess opened an overhead compartment before takeoff and saw a man in a pilot's cap staring back at her. She screamed and ran to the cockpit. No such person was on the manifest. When shown a crew photo, she pointed out Captain Loft. These were not isolated events. Reports surfaced across several aircraft, all of which shared one detail: they contained salvaged parts from Flight 401. Eastern Airlines officially denied any ghost sightings. The airline's management refused to publicly acknowledge the growing number of witness accounts. However, crew gossip persisted. In the highly superstitious world of aviation, some crew refused to fly on aircraft that included Flight 401 parts. A few attendants even resigned rather than continue flying those planes. Internal memos, allegedly circulated among senior staff, advised management to remove the recycled parts from any aircraft reporting unusual occurrences. While no official admission was ever made, multiple planes were quietly stripped of Flight 401 components, after which the strange events reportedly ceased. The tale of Flight 401 didn't remain confined to industry gossip. In 1976, author John G. Fuller published a best-selling book titled The Ghost of Flight 401, which chronicled the crash and the hauntings. The book drew from first-hand interviews with survivors, flight crew, and even investigators. It reignited public fascination with the supernatural and aviation safety. The book's popularity led to a made-for-TV movie in 1978 titled The Ghost of Flight 401, starring Ernest Borgnine and Kim Basinger, dramatizing both the tragedy and the paranormal events that followed. Though skeptics dismissed the ghost stories as trauma-induced hallucinations or urban legends, others insisted the spirits of Loft and Repo were protecting future passengers rather than causing harm. Beyond the ghost tales, the crash of Flight 401 left a lasting legacy in aviation safety. The incident led directly to the development of Crew Resource Management (CRM), a transformative change in how cockpit crews interact. CRM emphasized communication, cross-checking, and keeping at least one pilot always focused on flight instruments, regardless of distractions. Today, CRM is a standard part of pilot training worldwide, credited with saving countless lives over the decades. Furthermore, Flight 401 reminded the aviation industry that even minor mechanical glitches, like a burnt-out bulb, can become catastrophic when combined with human distraction. Modern aircraft are now built with layered fail-safes to prevent this exact kind of chain reaction failure. Today, more than 50 years after the crash, the story of Flight 401 still resonates. The Everglades have long since reclaimed the crash site. No marker stands there, only water, grass, and silence. But in the aviation world, Flight 401 is far from forgotten. Survivors and investigators have kept its memory alive. Documentaries, podcasts, and history channels continue to revisit the story, not just for the tragedy it represents, but for the eerie mystery it left behind. Whether or not you believe in ghosts, what happened after the crash, those sightings, warnings, and whispers, has become an indelible part of the Flight 401 story. Some say Loft and Repo were never haunting planes at all. They were simply doing their jobs, watching over passengers from beyond.